Hey, greetings, everybody. So, in this lecture, we're going to go through how to design a vulnerability management program. And hopefully, we will also have the opportunity to install Nessus Essentials in a VM, in particular, a Kali Linux VM, and potentially do a vulnerability scan or set up to do a vulnerability scan. So, let's go ahead and get started here. I'll start my slideshow and set the properties. Screen two, share. All right, excellent. So, in designing a vulnerability program, what we're going to do is look at how to implement different scanning methods. So the first step in doing this is picking some sort of vulnerability scanner. And you can also look at the different types of tools from an analysis perspective as to which one does better scanning given different situations. For example, um, in one of my last jobs that I had in my profession, we would use an open source scanner like a Nessus or an OpenVOS on the interior of our network. And we would collect all the information on our systems. Our systems didn't change that much. We didn't, add new PCs or new servers or new VMs. And so that stayed very, very, very static. However, from the outside perspective, we were changing a lot of directories and files and content within the web platforms and the web application platforms that were pointed at the internet for customers to use. So we used Qualys as a platform to scan from the outside, from the internet. And then we would tie the both of them together. So what you have to look at from a vulnerability management perspective is how do you ensure that you find all the different types of vulnerabilities from the different angles that traffic can traverse in your network. So let's take a look at identifying vulnerability requirements. So there are two different types of policies that you have to look at, are two different types of areas. Regulatory. So what is your business or organization going to be governed by from a regulation standpoint? Things like PCI DSS or the SEC, or if it's a bank, Graham Leach Bliley. And what corporate policies do you have that you have to follow or abide by as well? And like in the graphic, where is the overlap of these two? So I had mentioned PCI DSS. So we're currently on PCI DSS version 11.2, and it looks at ways that you have to do um, different regulatory guidelines of what specifics they include, such as an internal vulnerability scan, external vulnerability scan, quarterly change tracking, use of qualified personnel for all these aspects, and the approved use of different scanning tools or scanning vendors for them. So FISMA and FIPS are two regulatory areas that are done by the federal government, and they have a matrix, basically, like you see on the screen here, where they will look at different security objectives and potential impacts based on the CIA triad. So, identifying what you need to scan. So, it's very important that you bring out of your risk assessment and your organizational analysis what is critical to the business, to the organization. Is the system exposed to the internet? If it's not, you probably wouldn't include it in your, say, your exterior scan. What services are offered by the system? Do they have databases, for example? What content are they screening? Is the system a production test or development environment? We had all three at one of my jobs. So we would have a test environment, a development environment, and also a um, production environment, of course, we always ran scans in all three, and we would look at ways that hopefully they all matched up. Now, did they always match up? No, of course not, because we were doing things in development, and we would find vulnerabilities. We would find something that the developers didn't do. We moved from development to test, and hopefully we alleviated a lot of those vulnerabilities, mitigated them. If we didn't, that was the last place to do so. When we moved to the production environment, we felt very strongly that our scans would show no vulnerabilities whatsoever, or they wouldn't get moved from test to production. And I can only think of maybe one instance in about 4 or 5 years where we had a vulnerability that went from test to production. And that was only because we caught it at the very last minute and we did not mitigate it because it was a brand new vulnerability. And it just hit that perfect window where it snuck by. But for the most part, we'd never have anything go completely from test to production, much less development to test to production. So this is a good graphic of Qualys. Qualys is a scanner. It can be used both internally and externally. Qualys, the company, is one of the more well-known vulnerability scanning platforms out there. So one of the first steps that you have to do in setting up your vulnerability program is determining how often am I going to scan. So a lot of things go into that, into answering that question. So your risk appetite, your regulatory requirements, which is probably the biggest thing, your business constraints, technical constraints, and licensing. So a lot of those outside of regulatory requirements, um, and what comes into business constraints is going to be cost. So licensing, technical, risk appetite, that is going to play very heavily into how much is it going to cost to do this on a regular basis. Because Qualys isn't free. Now, there are a lot of free tools, but a lot of tools that will be accepted by regulatory requirements are not free. So they go through configuring an SS scan and going through and looking at an SS scan report. We're going to try to do that here shortly in real time. I'm going to bring up a Kali box and go through an install of Nessus, and we'll see how that goes. There are two types of scanning, active and passive. So active interacts with the environment. It's going to look at open ports. It's going to test applications. It's very noisy. It should get picked up by systems such as your intrusion prevention system, intrusion detection system. Passive is going to be more of a monitoring type of activity where you might have what we call agents on a network or agents on a system, and it is going to look and be used with host-based intrusion detection systems in order to find these vulnerabilities. So they go through and scoping out vulnerability scans. The questions that you have to ask here: what systems and networks will be included? What am I going to scan? What technical measures will be used, i.e. what platforms, what networks, where are the scanners going to be? Are they outside the network, inside the network? What tests will be performed? As you'll see here, when we get into the Nessus scan, there's all different types of scanning profiles that you can leverage. You also have to look at plugins. So plugins in different aspects of the Nessus scanner can be turned on or turned off. And you can really get very customized in how you use Nessus. And the same with other scanners as well. You can also supplement network scans, so you can provide credentials to go even deeper um, into the weeds, if you will. And you can run scans with or without credentials and compare them. So, for example, you can give root and username and passwords, administrator username and passwords for both local and domain users in a Windows environment, as well as database passwords. And it will go deeper and give you more of a picture of what may or may not be vulnerable. Security controls that may affect your scan results: firewall settings, network segmentation, IPS, IDS. You want to have these things on when you do the scan because you want to have your entire security layer available to you to try to help you mitigate anything that is out there. Or you can turn it off and say, okay, if I take this layer away or that layer away, am I still protected? There's a lot of give and take here. So from the scan perspective, you can launch a vulnerability scan. Again, there are different types of reports that come out of it. Here, we look at CVEs from the National Vulnerability Database of anything that we pick up. We can also dive into that database and just poke around and look at all of the vulnerabilities, whether they are on a system or not. These are done through plugins with Nessus, and we can add or remove different feeds from different vendors or different areas, different providers of these vulnerabilities. So after the scanning is done, we can look at how we're going to develop a remediation workflow. And this is very important. So once we find these vulnerabilities, we have to have a means and mechanism to eradicate them, mitigate them, remove them, however you want to look at it. So the test flow for this is basically we test, we scan, we detect, we document, and then we remediate, we remove. So here we're looking at the Qualys dashboard. And again, Qualys is mostly used from the outside of the network. It's used a lot for web-based systems to test web-based vulnerabilities. And they will give you a different report. So some of these have been grayed out with IE IP addresses, and they will go vulnerabilities by system. So on the left here, you would see the IP address or the host name, and then they would give you the number of high, medium, low, and informational. Red is bad, yellow is not so bad, green is even less bad, and blue you're gonna have a lot of because it's just gonna be informational things that it detects, like the port number, etc. So prioritization of remediation is critical because without it, we won't have a guideline to remove this stuff. So looking at the criticality of the systems and the vulnerability, difficulty of remediating the vulnerability. For example, if we find something that's in production that we have to remediate and we have to reboot the Windows server afterwards, well, that's going to institute downtime. So we may only have a window once a month to do it. We may have a change control parameter in there where we can do an emergency remediation and set that up, and just there's a whole communication process after that. Who do we notify? How do we notify them? When do we notify them, etc. The severity of vulnerability, as I said, and the exposure of the vulnerability. So the exposure is going to be how likely is this to be targeted. So the detailed vulnerability report is going to provide us information about the vulnerability to include write-ups of what it is, how to mitigate it, how it is exploited, etc. So you also need to test the fixes as well. So you might want to do a test, which is a vulnerability scan again after the remediations. Let's say we patched it. A patch was released by the manufacturer. Let's just say in this case, Microsoft for Windows. We applied the patch, and then we go and we redo the scan. If the vulnerability is gone, woohoo, we did our jobs and we got everything taken care of. So we can also delay remediations at time, depending on things such as workflow, severity of the vulnerability, criticality, risk, you name it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about overcoming these risks to vulnerability scanning. So some common barriers: customer commitments, service degradations, IT governance and change management processes. With the last one, we will typically have an entire process that will help guide us through. So for example, we may have policy set up in the company saying if we detect a critical vulnerability with a CVSS of 10.0, which is the very highest you get, that has to be corrected within 4 hours. people start communicating with customers, with IT, with IT sec, and that gets fixed very, very, very quickly. A maintenance window is immediately propped up. But if vulnerabilities are less severe and less likely to be leveraged by a bad actor, we could push that off to a more useful time, say a regular service window. All right, so let's talk a little bit about these scanning tools. So I talked a little bit about Nessus, and they outline it here in the slides, but I also spoke rather quickly about OpenVOS. That is an open source vulnerability scanner. Tenable Nessus is something that you pay for, but they do have a community edition, which you can scan up to 16 addresses at a time. Then you have Rapid7's Nexpose, which is a good one, and Qualys, which we talked about, their vulnerability scanner. That is typically a cloud-based scanner and is really good for use of scanning things that are sitting on the internet. Some other cloud assessment tools, Scout Suite, Paku, and Prowler. These are all scanners that can target cloud platform providers such as Google, Microsoft Azure, and AWS. Here we just look at a web application scanner that is in Linux or Kali Linux called Nikto. There's also Arachni. And scanning web applications is a little bit different than scanning network and network devices systems because you do a deeper dive into the code. It can analyze PHP, it can analyze .NET, it can analyze back-end applications, particularly databases. Nessus also has a web application scanner. A great free one out there is OWASP Zap. I use this a lot in assessments. And then Burp Proxy, which also has a scanner and an entire suite of testing tools that you can use for web application testing and even web application penetration testing. So that is going to close that up for now. We will bring over. Let's see. See if we can do a quick little demo. So, one of the things, let me just get my notes up here. Stop my share for 1 second. And find, here we go. All right, here we go. So one of the first things we need to do, go back to the share. One of the first things we need to do is download Nessus. So we need to understand what platform we are on. So again, I'm installing this in a Kali Linux environment. And Kali Linux is on Debian. So I'm going to do Debian 64-bit. And this is the version. That's only going to give me the one version, so I'm going to download it. And it's going to give you a EULA. That you need to read through. And agree to. There we go. Sometimes there we go. Oh, looks so nice. I downloaded it twice. Oops. Let's just quickly go to file manager here. All right, I don't need that one because I already got it. It looks like it was a grand total of 66.2 megabytes. Now I'm going to move this to so like I said, I had made another, there it is, folder under Nessus. So I'll go ahead and paste that there. And then I'm going to bring up a terminal. Oops, there we go. Too many terminals. VM is running a little slow. And then I'm going to depackage it. I'm going to go into that. Oh, it's right there. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and do tpkg dash I. All right. It's going to blow it up and expand it. So I'll let that work. I'll pause the, oh, never mind. I won't pause it. We're ready to go. All right. And then we just hopefully just need to start the system. Okay. Then we'll do a status on that. Make sure it's running. It is active and running. All right. Good deal. And then if we bring up let's bring up another tab here. We should just be able to go to our local. I think that is the, yep. So it's your local IP or just home 127.0.0.1 and the port 8834. It's going to bring it up in HTTPS, so you have to go through and accept all the everything here. All right. It says welcome to Nessus. And I did forget one thing. I need to register Nessus. Signing key. Don't need that actually. Let's do this. So we need to get to download the vulnerability scanner because you have to get a key. So we'll do the try it now. We don't want expert, we want essentials. This is essentials. There we are. There we go. So you have to look for the essentials. So I'll just put my first name in here. Email. I'll pause this real quick. Okay, so after that is done, we can um I basically they send you an email with your activation code. Go back to Nessus setup. All right, now that we have our activation code, we'll hit continue. And we want to register Nessus Essentials. Click continue. First name you gave them. Email you gave them. Yo, I did something wrong. Okay, register. Already have activation code. Skip this. And set manual. Okay, so skip. There we go. There's our activation code. Yay. All right. And all right. So we just have to make a username and password. So username and password. Setup complete. And now it's going to download and set everything up. So I'll be back when that is done. Okay, so that only took a couple of minutes. They keep trying to have you get a Nessus Expert so you can do more IPs and have more plugins. And I'm gonna say no to that. So I'm just gonna click on the X there. And now it looks like it's ready to go. So if you know what your home network is, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. So if I come here to my command prompt, clear, if I type in if config, I get my address as there's my F0 192.168.1.38. I know I'm the upper echelon of the network. Let's say I want to scan my PC, my home network, or my home system. So if I come in here and let me just bring up a command on my Windows machine. So this is a command prompt on my Windows machine. So I should have a node on here as well, or an IP on here as well. There it is. It's saying my Ethernet adapter on VMnet 8 is .1, but it is also bridged over to a regular wireless adapter. I'm doing everything. So it's 1.143. So let me see if I can ping 1.143. I cannot. See if I can ping one. But I can ping one, and that's my IP address. So I can go ahead and scan .1. I can give it just one IP to scan. Yeah. So let's just go ahead and it should be done setting up, I would think. It may still be installing. One moment. Okay, so the little rotating circle here, if you hover over it, it says copying plugins. So we have to let that complete before we can set up a scan. So we'll be back when that is ready. Okay, so after you go through the plugins, you can now input your IP. So I'm just going to put one in, and you can always change this later. So I'm just going to put that in there for now. You can add additional uh, information such as DNS. I click the box here, and I'm just going to run a quick scan. This is just a basic network scan. We'll come back when it's over. Okay, so to resume here and finish up, basically this is what we look at getting. So as a result of the scan. So the scan completed, and it tells us our operating system, which got it correctly. Mine's Windows 10 Pro. Um, and it tells us all these informational items. Looks like I have one medium vulnerability, and I bet you this is probably going to get fixed when I do updates here this week. So it gives you information about the CVSS, the CVE, right? Oh no, this looks like it's a long one. Oh, it was modified in October 2022. So I can go through. Maybe this is not tied to a patch per se. Maybe it's tied to a configuration. Definitely look into that. And yeah, that's about it. You could download this, print it out, rerun it. So that is the basic network scan. You can also configure it. You can launch a different type of scan. Go here to my scans here. So that one completed today. Um, I'm going to delete that one. I don't want it. I can create a new scan. So I click on new scan. That was the host discovery. That was the one, the basic network scan, excuse me. That was the one I did. I can do an advanced scan. That'll give me more information, the malware scan, etc. So, yep, that's it. That is the basics of using Nessus. And that's going to conclude our lecture for the day. So have a great one, and we will see you soon.